Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you can leave a like and a follow for more content like this.
Chapter 18. 3 years. 3 years later, in the 287th year after the conquest, Wright and Gunthor traveled by carriage to Highgarden to attend the tournament hosted by House Tyrell. Of course, they weren't there to compete, but to discuss matters with Renly. Since Highgarden lay between Storm's End and Old Town, Wright and Renly had been handling day-to-day affairs via ravens. For more significant matters, they often met at Highgarden. This was also a way of strengthening ties with House Tyrell, something that Robert hoped to see. Many families in the Reach still privately supported House Targaryen, and stabilizing the South, including the Reach and Dorne, was a task mostly entrusted to Wright and Renly. Over the past 3 years, Wright first studied ravenry. Ravens were a low-level magical beast, and with his innate magical power, he was able to master the subject quickly. After crafting a black iron ring to represent his study of ravenry, he considered that discipline completed. He then began exchanging letters with his 3 brothers. Robert and Cersei had a golden-haired prince named Joffrey in 286, living a blissful life. Stannis remained unmarried, though it was unclear whether he had any mistresses. His letters were brief, mostly asking for ways to increase the betting income from the tourney. It seemed his ambitions lay in becoming a betting magnate. Renly mentioned that Robert had sent a bastard daughter named Maya Stone to Storm's End for him to raise. Wright found this quite surprising, as Maya was already a few years old. Wright also wrote frequent letters to Nymeria, expressing his longing. She was still his betrothed, and considering Dorne's more open customs, he feared that if he wasn't careful, he might lose her to another. In modern times, there were many stories of people falling for others online without ever meeting, sending money, only to discover later that the person was much older than expected. Wright wanted to avoid such a fate, focusing on building a strong relationship with Nymeria to minimize the risk of being betrayed. Nymeria's younger sister, Tyene, had taken up the role of Nymeria's personal knight and was also learning the art of poison-making from their father, Prince Martell. Tyene even joked that if Wright ever wronged Nymeria, she would poison him. Wright, amused, thought the young girl still had much to learn. They also heard that Oberyn had gone to the east as a mercenary and hadn't been seen in a long time. Whether this was true or not, Wright thought, it seemed difficult to imagine the Red Viper staying in one place for long. The second subject Wright mastered was the red copper ring. Medicine. Using knowledge from the modern world, he amazed the scholars of the Citadel. Techniques like using alcohol for sterilization, suturing with catgut, blood type testing, and disease isolation began to take root. By the end of the year, maesters across the 7 kingdoms started keeping alcohol and surgical supplies in stock, greatly reducing the mortality rate among the injured. The third was the Golden Ring, economics. The world's economic system was quite simple, and Wright model for the tournament's economic structure fascinated the masters. Teaching others how to make money was no easy feat. The fourth was the White Steel Ring, metallurgy. With the bonus from his system's forging skill, Wright improved his ability, crafting the White Steel Ring while significantly boosting his skills. He had also created a treadle-operated leather wheel mechanism, similar to a modern sewing machine, but less precise. This could be used for jewelry making. The Citadel and Storm's End produced a small quantity, though the demand was still low. The 5th ring crafted was the Bronze Ring, astronomy. Wright had studied mechanical engineering in the modern world. He introduced the 24-hour timekeeping system and time measurement methods, then combined this with his knowledge of mechanics to design a large 24-hour clock. The timekeeping method in Westeros was still primitive. Apart from the maesters, who could measure large seasonal changes, people still lived by the daily cycle of sunrise and sunset. Wright generously donated his design blueprints to the Citadel. They immediately set the Citadel's location as the standard meridian time and used their connections to get local lords to fund the construction of clock towers in their cities. A master from the Citadel was assigned to each tower to perform daily time calculations and synchronize the clocks. Soon, clock towers were built in the capitals of all the regions, and the idea began to spread to other cities. The citadel profited from the construction and operation of the towers, leading to a high level of enthusiasm among them. Apprentices studying architecture, metallurgy, and astronomy frequently brought Wright meat as a token of gratitude. However, the large clocks were the most basic mechanical structures. Otherwise, Wright would not have sent the drawings to the citadel. His real plan to profit was by creating watches that could be placed in homes. These devices would eventually require a quartz calibration system, but since this wasn't yet available, it was more feasible to first spread clock towers and grandfather clocks across the land. It would take many years for Wright to make watches on his own, but the citadel had the resources to make it happen faster. The main purpose of their trip to Highgarden was to sell the first batch of grandfather clocks produced in Storm's End to House Tyrell. This was Wright and Renly's business venture. Wright and Renly had come to realize the high costs of practicing magic. Wright advanced magic and Renly's intermediate magic were no longer simple tasks of reading books. They required practical equipment to properly channel magical energy. To craft such equipment, it needed to be made from Valyrian steel. While Wright forging skills couldn't yet produce Valyrian steel, he could still reforge it. Magic-supporting equipment wasn't considered magical items, but rather devices that facilitated the flow of magic, similar to modern-day physics and chemistry apparatus. According to his research, during the later years of the Valyrian dynasty, it was estimated that thousands of Valyrian steel weapons, such as swords and daggers, were produced. Of those, 227 were known to be in Westeros, and the rest had either been destroyed or repurposed into items like forks, knives, and jewelry. Renly began to send people to search the continent for any broken pieces of Valyrian steel. These were collected and sent to the citadel for Wright to reforge into magic-supporting equipment. Wright would write his observations after testing the items and then send them back to Storm's End for Renly. It wasn't until one day, when the household staff mentioned that the monthly stipend had run out, that Wright and Renly realized they needed to start finding ways to make money. Highgarden, the capital of the Reach, was surrounded by the most beautiful scenery. The White Castle was nestled among fields and flowers, with many golden roses. The walls were built in a 3-layer concentric circle structure. Inside the first and second layers, there were various homes and meticulously designed plant mazes. Without a guide, it would be impossible to find the gates. Many fortresses in this era used such maze structures to complicate siege attempts. As they ventured deeper, they entered a massive garden. Courtyards, painted walls, artificial waterfalls, and marble corridors and sculptures could be found, truly making it the most beautiful castle in all the 7 kingdoms. In comparison, Storm's End, the Baratheon stronghold, felt like a large prison. However, House Tyrell's rise to power was not without its problems. Many of their vassals were dissatisfied with them. Around 300 years ago, during the conquest, King Aegon burned the ruling family of the Reach. House Tyrell, then the steward, opened the gates and surrendered. Aegon appointed their steward as the Lord of Highgarden and the protector of the Reach. This caused much discontent among the other noble families, who questioned why a mere steward should hold such a title. But due to Aegon's overwhelming power, they couldn't openly oppose it. Since then, House Tyrell had relied on strategic marriages and the distribution of favors to solidify their power. Garland Tyrell was waiting at the door of the hall. The once chubby boy had slimmed down a bit, and his brother had given him a nickname, Garland the Gallant. Chapter 19. The Specialty of Storm's End. After the maid led them to the study, Wright reflected on the time when Gunthor had helped him gather materials for the prototype while he was at the Citadel. Gunthor had been thoroughly impressed with Wright craftsmanship and had wanted to involve his family in the clock business, but Wright had refused. After all, this was a high-tech creation, and the core mechanism had to be made personally, so it couldn't be mass-produced. It could only be considered a rare, luxury item. Moreover, Gunthor had already bought the first prototype and placed it in his own home, so he wasn't particularly interested in showcasing it again. The maid served them hot cocoa, and the maid who was allowed in the study was a relative of the Tyrell family. Over the generations, as the family grew, the branch families would send their younger children to serve the main house. The boys would become knights or squires to serve the male members, and the girls would serve as maids for the female members. Boys growing up in the main house would often be knighted, and girls could find a good marriage. After chatting with the maid for a while, the Tyrells and Renly arrived at the study. Olenna was the first to speak. "Impressive, Meister Wright. You've created something remarkable again." Wright, fully aware that he would never be a Meister, much less a Grand Meister, couldn't help but feel pricked by the old Rose's words. He glanced at Renly, who wore a smile, and realized that Olenna had likely bought the clock on the spot, which made him feel a bit uncomfortable. Wright didn't take the bait. "Good afternoon, my lady. This clock can be convenient for every household. Accurate timekeeping is essential. When servants wake up, when guards take their posts, when cooks start preparing meals, when banquets begin, when study sessions start, and when training starts. These things all have practical benefits." "Well said, but at 7,000 gold dragons for a clock, do you want to become an Ironborn?" Olenna continued her jabs as the others took their seats. "Taken by force is better than toiling away," Renly interrupted, quickly taking over the conversation. "Though I agree with the sentiment, they'll always just be a band of pirates, destined to be swept away by time." Olenna glanced at Renly, then at Wright, and fell silent for a moment before changing the subject. "You didn't come just to showcase the clock, did you? My lady, do you agree with my earlier opinion on the clock? Do you think the nobility across the realm will buy it?" "I've come to discuss this matter," Wright replied. "What do you propose?" Olenna asked, getting straight to the point. She was tired of the small talk. Instead of answering immediately, Wright turned to Renly. "Renly, how many clocks can we produce now?" Renly took a sip of hot cocoa, savoring the sweetness. "Now, Sir Donal Noy and his apprentices can produce 5 clocks a week." In the original story, Donal Noy was a blacksmith from Storm's End who had lost his hand during Robert's rebellion and ultimately became a member of the Night's Watch. Thanks to Wright influence, his blacksmithing skills had greatly improved, and Renly had made him a knight to bind him more closely to House Baratheon. His apprentices had also received monthly pay increases, and Storm's End's forge had expanded considerably. In addition to weapons and armor, they were now making clock parts. Wright spoke to Olenna. "A clock needs not only the core, but also high-quality wood and decorative items. After calculating the costs, I can offer you a price of 5,000 gold dragons per clock. The selling price across the realm will be a fixed 7,000 gold dragons. For any customizations, we won't set a price. We'll negotiate those separately. We will increase production according to orders." After a brief pause, he added, "But for now, we need to finalize the regional distribution rights." Olenna thought for a moment, gazing into Wright's eyes. "The clock is expensive, but even if all the nobles of the Reach buy one, it won't make much profit. Why go through all this trouble?" Wright stood up. "To be honest, my lady, the clock towers across the realm are the first step. I'm not making money from them. I only want to ensure that everyone has accurate time. The clock is the second step. After covering costs, it'll make a small profit, but the real benefit is bringing precise time into people's homes. The third step is where the real profit lies. I'm currently working on a pocket-sized clock, something you can carry around in your pocket, a watch. So, we're not just discussing the distribution rights for the clock, but for the clock, the watch, and everything I will create in the future." Hearing this, Olenna, Mace, Renly, Gunthor, and several of the younger Tyrell family members all began to pay serious attention. Olenna then made her position clear. "I agree with your price. I want the distribution rights for the Reach, the Westerlands, and Dorne. The Westerlands I can give you, but Dorne will be a challenge. The Reach and Dorne may have recently besieged Storm's End together, but your two regions have been enemies for thousands of years, with deep-seated grudges," Wright replied. Given the current situation, he wanted to make money from the Westerlands without getting too closely tied to them. Since they wanted it, he would give it to them. While Storm's End and Dorne were also filled with centuries-old feuds, there were heavy forces at the borders, and his family was in a royal marriage with Dorne, so there were avenues he could explore. Then I have a proposal, my lady. The Tyrells will handle the Reach and the Westerlands. The Baratheons will cover Storm's End, the Crownlands, the Riverlands, the Vale, and the North. For Dorne, our two families can each take whatever we can manage. Gunthor's house will cover Old Town. As for the 9 free cities, we will work together with Dorne as we do with them. Gunthor had no objections. This had already been discussed with Wright. As the third son of his house, he had no significant prospects, so he had gone to study at the Citadel. He finally got in touch with Wright because of theirs classmate relationship. He didn't want to think too much and just do a good job in the family station and overseas. Others didn't have this opportunity. Olenna glanced at Gunthor, thinking about House Hightower's strength and mercantile skill. After a moment's thought, she agreed and summoned a scribe to draft the documents. While the scribe prepared the papers and pens, Wright held up his hand. By the way, add 2 more things: fountain pens and chocolate. Lord Mace was puzzled. Fountain pens and chocolate? What are those? Renly nodded to Wright, who gestured for him to open the wooden box he had brought, retrieving 6 fountain pens to offer to Olenna, Mace, Valeris, Garland, Loras, and Margaery. Everyone turned the pens over in their hands. The bodies were made of ivory, smooth, rounded columns with a metal band on them. They couldn't figure out how these pens could actually write. Renly took out his own pen, which was similar in shape, but made of bright white metal. This one is mine. Sterling silver with gold inlay. I prefer this weight, Renly explained, revealing the luxury of his pen. In this world, ivory pens were more valuable than sterling silver with gold inlay. The Tyrells finally realized that the metal band was actually for attaching the pen to clothing. The children also began trying them on their garments. Lord Mace, noticing that Wright and Gunthor had similar pens with metal bands, had originally assumed the bands were purely decorative. They both removed their pens, and Wright was made of white steel, representing the Citadel's metallurgy studies. Gunthor's pen had a wooden casing, which looked more modest, prompting him to explain, I had to change the casing to wood because I write so much at the Citadel that my hand gets sore. The weight of the white steel casing was too much for me. Renly walked up to the scribe, unscrewed the front and back caps of his pen, dipped it in ink, and began to write the agreement. The nib is made of an alloy, Wright, invented, and the ink reservoir is sewn from sheep gut. A single dip can write around 3,000 words. Don't let the simple design fool you. Wright has already figured out how to mass-produce it. And a copy, made elsewhere, would cost 3 to 4 times as much as the ones produced at Storm's End. The scribe began writing the agreement. The pen's nib had a slight curve, creating beautifully ornate cursive writing, and it could continue writing without needing to dip the nib in ink after just a few words, making it far superior to a quill. As for the chocolate, Renly raised his cup. It's made from cocoa beans. Cocoa is a drink, but chocolate is a solid block, much like sugar cubes. Cocoa cultivation was also introduced by Wright at the Citadel. Before, no one ate it. Only the mountain folk chewed the seeds raw. Lord Mace took a sip and added, In a couple of years, the new cocoa trees will start bearing fruit. Right now, the cocoa beans we use are bought from the mountain folk. Wright beamed with pride. It's a fine drink, isn't it? Grind the cocoa beans into powder, add some milk, and for those who like it sweet, you can add sugar. Both adults and children love it. In this world, children only drank water. Milk was a luxury in homes that kept dairy cows. Having traveled widely and recorded local produce, Wright had collaborated with the Citadel to study agriculture. The Citadel had no formal agricultural department, and farming practices in this world were still quite primitive. Although Wright had never formally studied agriculture, most people had a basic understanding of it. After entering the Citadel, he had applied reverse engineering to conduct numerous trials, and through methods like cross-pollination, grafting, seed selection, and fertilization, he improved the yield of short-growing season crops. He also wrote a guide for selecting the best crops suited to different regions. called the selection of superior crops, and thus agricultural science had recently been added to the curriculum. The harvests across the 7 kingdoms were increasing year by year. By now, the Reach had begun cultivating sugarcane and cocoa trees. Dorne was planting all kinds of fruit trees, and even the North had started growing peas, rye, and oats in large quantities, as well as selecting and cultivating pasture grasses. This was Wright's greatest contribution to this world so far. Does this agreement also include the sale of sugarcane and cocoa? Olenna asked, noticing the additional details. Don't worry, my lady, Wright replied. Our agreement doesn't cover raw materials or any other products made from them, only the items we've specifically agreed upon. Olenna walked over to the scribe's desk and saw the beautiful script written with the fountain pen. Add the fountain pen and chocolate to the agreement, she said. With the major deal settled, everyone in the room felt pleased, and they moved on to more casual conversation. Wright noticed 4-year-old Margaery sitting alone, pouting. He approached her, cupped her face in his hands, and gently turned her frown into a smile. What's wrong, little Margaery? Why the long face? Margaery, holding the fountain pen, lowered her head. I can't write yet. I don't like the fountain pen. Ha 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 ha. Laughter spread around the room. In this world, noble children usually began learning to write around the age of 6, and Wright was an exception. Renly had learned at a very young age, tutored by Wright, and while he had once been resentful, he now felt superior. I couldn't write when I was 4, but I could already write hundreds of words. Boys like swords and knives, girls like dolls. Luckily, I was prepared, Wright said, pulling a metal brooch from his pocket and handing it to Margaery. The brooch was shaped like a rose with red petals and green leaves. It wasn't inlaid with jewels. Instead, the metal was colored. The back of the brooch was unpolished, showing the original gray-black metal and smoky patterns. Margaery smiled, intrigued by the beautiful object. While it wasn't a doll, young girls could still be attracted to pretty things. She turned the brooch over and over, noticing the inscription on the back, and handed it to her grandmother, asking, "What does this mean?" Olenna examined the brooch. Though it wasn't adorned with gemstones, its craftsmanship was exquisite. The patterns on the petals and leaves were finely detailed, matching the work of the finest jewelers. However, the inscription on the back, resembling characters scratched by animal claws, puzzled her. She then focused on the material. What is this made of? I've been studying mysticism recently, Wright explained. This brooch is made from Valyrian steel. The inscription on the back is High Valyrian, engraved to read Eternal Life. High Valyrian, like the dragon language from the Elder Scrolls V, was something Wright had been studying at the Citadel. He had read many books on Valyria and even found some works on dragon language in the energy sphere, which had allowed him to become proficient in both Common Valyrian, English, and High Valyrian, dragon language. Valyrian steel was known for its rarity and expensive cost, with large items being especially rare. Smaller items made from it existed, but they were extremely scarce. The others gathered around to admire the brooch. You really put a lot of thought into this, Olenna said, looking at Wright, her mind racing with thoughts. Valyrian steel swords are very expensive, but there are still some fragments available for purchase. I wanted to practice making a mystical pendant, and since I was coming to Highgarden, I figured Margaery might not like the things I brought, so I made a brooch for her. Wright truly had no romantic interest in little Margaery, especially as he was already betrothed to someone. His main goal was to establish good business ties with the Tyrells, using agricultural resources from the Reach. Storm's End didn't have much arable land. Most of it was used for growing grain. Olenna, sensing no need to continue the topic, called everyone to the dinner table. Chapter 20. Making Money, Not Too Shabby. That evening, Renly rushed into Wright's room to talk. "We're out of money," Renly said, frustrated. "You had me spend all the remaining money on this outfit and accessories. Are we sure we're going to make money from this?" Wright looked at Renly's lavish clothes and accessories. "Doing business requires packaging. Even if you're broke, you have to look wealthy. This builds trust with others. I'm still the Lord of Storm's End. Do I really need to do this? Am I supposed to become a merchant? Renly was confused. You're a lord, but you're a 10-name day, Wright replied. And there are two types of lords, the rich ones and the poor ones. Wright answered Renly's questions one by one. By creating the image that you're wealthy, over time, even if you're penniless, others will still think you have money. They'll want to do business with you. For example, with the cocoa beans, I'm negotiating for payment next quarter. By then, once the first batch of chocolate sells, we'll have money. Wright and Renly were partners in business, with a 70-30 split. Renly contributed 70%, including capital, workers, premises, transportation, and sales, while Wright took 30%, providing the technology, sales strategy, and training for the workers. I don't need to showcase myself like that. I could recite the speeches from the hall. I've been practicing them for days, Renly said, now starting to care more about his image. Every new venture needs a leader, and you, Lord of Storm's End, are not only the seller, but the best leader for it, Wright said, placing a hand on Renly's shoulder. Once you create your wealthy image and maintain a good business reputation in the future, when you're doing business, all you need to do is stand there. Even if you don't say a word, your mere presence will seal the deal. Renly, excited by the idea of making business just by standing there, instantly became filled with energy. When I will give it a try, there's no try. Every morning you just need to repeat to yourself, I can do this. And soon enough, you will. Renly nodded enthusiastically. Since childhood, Renly had always known that his younger brother was exceptionally clever and had even taught him magic. When they were young, he was forced to study and practice swords. But as he grew, he realized how much ahead of his peers he had become. His brother always thought of him first and never betrayed him. Renly, while deeply grateful and admiring of his brother, sometimes wondered who the younger sibling really was. Had their parents mixed up the birth dates? After finalizing the business arrangements, Wright and Renly decided to head to the tournament to watch the competition. Stannis had also arrived, having been hired by Lord Mace to help organize the tournament. The reason Wright hadn't seen him the day before was because Stannis had been busy with preparations for the event. In the 20 years that Tywin served as Hand of the King, he had advocated for the holding of tournaments. Back then, each tournament was funded by individual nobles, who used their own money and prize funds to display their strength and gain some honor, though these events usually resulted in a significant financial loss. However, after the tournament at Storm's End a few years ago, Stannis began making a considerable profit from these events. Once Robert became king, he found various excuses to hold tournaments, with Stannis handling the organization each time. King Robert's extravagant lifestyle and massive expenditures, coupled with the lack of a dedicated treasury official, now Jon Arryn was handling both political duties and finances, meant the crown had to borrow money from various sources. They borrowed from Tywin, from Highgarden, and from Storm's End. Yet, after every tournament, they managed to repay a portion of the debt. Over time, the members of the small council became aware of this arrangement. The master of ships, Stannis, was hardly focused on his naval duties. He relied on the gambling profits from the tournaments to replenish Robert's coffers. Robert kept this a secret, but of course, the news still spread. The people of Westeros worshipped the Seven, and the Seven's teachings condemn gambling, bastards, and most severely, incest and regicide. While incest and regicide were considered serious crimes, punishable by death or exile to the Night's Watch, gambling and bastards were less severely condemned. In practice, what people said and what they did were often two different things. Other nobles had tried to imitate this practice of organizing betting on tournaments, but determining odds was difficult, and in one case, a noble even sold his castle after holding a tournament. In King's Landing, Robert couldn't hold tournaments every month, especially now that peace had settled. Stannis, often idle during peaceful times, was contacted by Lord Mace to help organize a tournament in Highgarden, promising him a generous reward. Wright found Stannis, and though the tournament was being organized by Highgarden, It was Stannis who brought in his own people to handle the betting operations. His uncle, Lomas Estermont, had also arrived, as had Stannis' other relatives. Lord Mace could only manage the accounts. As long as money was made, he was satisfied. Lomas, who had been sent to Dragonstone, was now a vassal to Stannis, while his older brother remained a vassal of Bluegarden, a typical case of hedging bets on both sides. Stannis' uncle, Wright and Bluegarden greeted them. "Ah, Wright. You wrote to me saying you had something good to show me?" Stannis asked, not one for pleasantries. Had it not been for your letter, Stannis wouldn't have agreed to come to Highgarden. We'd still be training the Navy. Lomas immediately spoke up, unabashedly. "You're training what Navy? Don't try to fool me with that excuse. I know exactly what you're up to. Come, let's sit at that table," Wright said, pulling back the curtain on their motives. The family spoke freely among themselves. Wright set a wooden box on the table and arranged chairs for the four of them to sit around. This is called mahjong, 144 tiles in total. He opened the box and began explaining the rules, showing them how to play. It's a game of intellect, although there is some luck involved, but skill is the key. But it requires 4 players, and it's not a game for the poor. Stannis, you could find a large, spacious venue in the noble district of King's Landing. Ideally, a multi-story building with comfortable seating, high-quality mahjong tiles, and private rooms upstairs. Both Stannis and Lomas' eyes lit up at the thought. Making these mahjong tiles is simple enough, but the key is who you play with. If you can find a luxurious venue, attract some nobles to join the game, the other nobles will surely follow. The real money isn't in selling the mahjong tiles, but in room fees, drinks, and a cut of the winnings. You understand what I mean. Wright wasn't sure if mahjong would catch on. After all, there were places in the real world where no one played it, no matter how much you promoted it. It was a matter of cultural acceptance, and some things just couldn't be helped. I'll leave this to you. In exchange, all the mahjong sets you use in King's Landing must be ordered from Storm's End. These are just samples for now, but I'll have Renly procure the finest materials for crafting them, so they'll feel perfect to the touch. Very well. I'll talk to you more about it when we're done here, Stannis replied, as always, succinctly. Chapter 21. Highgarden. The tournament was being held in the open field outside Highgarden, but Wright and Lord Mace did not go to the venue. Instead, they headed to a nearby sugarcane field to discuss the issue of sugarcane paper. This year, the harvest in the Reach had increased again, and there was a large-scale planting of sugarcane for sugar production. However, after processing the sugar, a great deal of sugarcane residue remained. Wright had passed by a workshop in Highgarden on his way here and had the idea to use the residue to make paper. Sugarcane paper, unless it can be made using the techniques from the modern world, is soft but lacks smoothness, has high water absorption, and is not suitable for writing. However, it makes excellent toilet paper. Having toilet paper would certainly be much more comfortable. Wright had originally thought of giving the business to Renly. While toilet paper was cheap, it was a daily necessity and a consumable item. If sold across the entire continent, Renly could become the toilet paper magnate. However, dealing with such lowly products didn't have a good reputation in this world. More importantly, given Westeros' transportation limitations, it would only be viable to operate in the Reach, where sugarcane was grown. Otherwise, the cost would be too high, and there was even a risk of making a loss. When Wright mentioned the idea to Lord Mace, he became very interested. He could arrange for others in his family to handle it, avoiding any damage to his own reputation as long as the business was profitable. Wright thought for a moment. There were many things that Highgarden could provide, and more money-making opportunities would emerge. He didn't mind adding this one to the list. The two were discussing production details for the sugarcane when suddenly a guard wearing a stag crown cloak rushed over. Lord Renly has been severely injured in the tournament, pierced through the abdomen, and has been carried back to the guest room. Please, my lord, come quickly. Wright immediately took off running. He remembered from the books that it was the Red Viper who had crippled Willis' leg in Highgarden. But Willis was only 13 and hadn't participated in the tournament. The Red Viper wasn't even present this time, so this must have been an event that happened later. Was someone trying to hurt Renly and provoke a conflict between Highgarden and Storm's End? The more Wright thought about it, the worse it seemed. Renly was now his own brother and also his business partner. Whoever dared to harm him would find their entire family's skulls shattered. Lord Mace, too overweight to keep up, moved slowly while Wright rushed ahead to the guest room. Aside from Margaery, all the Tyrells were already there. Renly was half undressed, and a finger-length wound on his abdomen was bleeding, with a maid cleaning the injury with water. "Is this it?" "I thought you were dying," Wright said, pointing at the wound. With Renly's magical abilities, the wound should have healed in less than a minute. "I've already used a healing spell, but my magic is exhausted. I sent the guard to find you, though he might have exaggerated a bit," Renly said, weakly. Wright carefully examined the wound. If it still looked like this after healing magic had been used, then it must have been quite severe at first. He raised his right hand and cast another healing spell on Renly. The wound began to heal at a visibly fast rate until it completely disappeared. He had mentioned his use of magic to Robert and Renly years ago and made it clear that there was no need to hide it. However, there weren't many opportunities to demonstrate it, so most people assumed that the Baratheon brothers were just speaking in jest. But now, the Tyrells had seen it with their own eyes. Still, it wasn't a good moment for them to ask about it. Looking at Renly's pale face and lips, Wright could tell that he must have lost a lot of blood earlier. Magic can only heal the wound, but the blood you lost can't be restored. In the future, when you get injured, use magic to stop the bleeding first, then use the remaining magic to heal the internal injuries. Don't think that just because you have magic, you can do whatever you want. Knowing how to use magic efficiently with limited energy takes a lot of experience. Renly remained silent, not replying. It was Lady Olenna who broke the silence. "Renly, you're growing up and starting to participate in the tournaments. Loras Tyrell, would you consider becoming Renly's squire?" Loras Tyrell had witnessed Renly's bravery in the tournament. While the magic helped, it was still rare for someone so young to compete so fearlessly. The next day, Renly was already back on his feet, jumping around. Wright and Renly stood on the castle's windowsill, looking out at the tournament grounds. Renly had already been eliminated, so he wouldn't be going back. "I forgot to ask you yesterday, how did you end up in the tournament? And how did you get injured?" "I've learned Stoneflesh, so I thought if I used that magic, no one would be able to hurt me. I borrowed a guard's set of armor and joined the competition," Renly explained. "At first, everything was going well. Before each round, I would cast Stoneflesh on myself. My opponents and the audience only saw the magical glow around me and didn't know its true effect. They still tried to fight me like they would any ordinary knight, but none of them could land a blow. I defeated them all." Wright asked Renly, "So how did you get injured?" "I ran out of magic. I only had enough for one more stone flesh spell. After winning a few rounds, I faced a tough opponent. We broke more than 10 lances, and by the time my stone flesh spell wore off, I didn't notice that my armor had shifted, and I was stabbed in the abdomen." "Your armor was custom made. The borrowed armor you wore didn't fit properly. It must have loosened while riding, especially after all that jostling. Once we have the money, we should each get our own armor made," Wright said. Hearing this, he felt relieved, realizing that no one had intentionally tried to harm Renly. "So, you plan to enter the tournament too?" Renly asked. "Yeah, if you can do it, why can't I? But I'll have to wait until after I return from the Citadel," Wright replied confidently. "But after I used magic yesterday, the way the audience looked at me, it wasn't just amazement. It was more like disdain. It felt like they thought I was cheating," Renly admitted, looking a bit uncomfortable. Wright thought for a moment before sharing his opinion. "That's true. In battle, it's a matter of life and death. Even dragons can be used in war, and the only thing that matters is the winner. If you use magic to win a war, you'll be a hero. But a tournament isn't a battlefield. It's supposed to be fair. You have magic, and they don't. To them, it'll seem like cheating, taking advantage. In a tournament, You need to win using equal strength, and that's how they'll see you as honorable. For example, in duels, if one person only has one hand, the other will usually forego one hand to make it a fair fight. Does that mean I can't use magic in the tournament from now on? Renly asked. No, if you win with your physical strength, that's best. But what if your opponent is also a mage? Wright answered, and Renly gave him a puzzled look. Wright smiled. For example, what if you face me in a tournament? Renly immediately replied, then I'd just forfeit. I'd fight you with the same magic, so we can have a fair duel. Well, now I'm really looking forward to that. But not this time. My magic won't be fully restored for at least half a month, Renly said, his excitement growing. He had seen many knightly duels, but he had never heard of or witnessed a wizard's duel. The two brothers looked out into the distance again. The age of magic will come, eventually. Chapter 22. Return to King's Landing. The tournament had ended, and Wright returned to the Citadel to continue his studies while remotely managing various businesses. The financial situation of Storm's End gradually improved. Although it couldn't match the long-standing wealth of Highgarden and the Westerlands, it was a far cry from its former state. Storm's End, originally a military stronghold, was now becoming a city. Renly had already made a request to Robert to rename the new area outside the keep as Wind's Rest City. Previously, there had only been the castle and a few houses where the local people lived. Now, according to Wright's plans, Renly was overseeing the construction of the first outer wall, which would protect the industrial area directly belonging to Storm's End. This area included warehouses, production zones, workers' rest areas, logistics zones, and barracks, all separated by independent walls. Locals referred to this section as the Wind's Rest City Industrial Zone. Beyond the industrial zone, there were plans for residential, commercial, and other business districts. One industry inevitably led to others. As the clock tower and chocolate factory were established in Wind's Rest City, other merchants were also setting up their businesses nearby. There were transport companies, wood merchants, blacksmiths, and sugar factories. In the Wind's Rest City Industrial Zone, workers generally earned higher wages than in other places, and several supervisors had been made knights by Renly. These higher-income workers also lived in the city after finishing their shifts, which created a demand for various services, such as inns, general stores, clothing shops, entertainment areas, and markets. The entire Wind's Rest City was expanding rapidly, and a new outer wall had to be built for protection. Fortunately, 3 sides of the city were surrounded by the sea, which saved a significant amount of money on construction. Wright had also planned for a sewage system. Wind's Rest. City sat on a cliff by the sea, and since there were no chemical compounds, waste could be directly released into the ocean. Over the years, the fish in the sea had grown plumper. The roads within the city were wide, and green belts lined both sides of each road. There were also squares and parks in every small section for people to relax. The only issue was the strong winds, which made it difficult to plant trees. Currently, they were experimenting with wind-resistant coconut and palm trees from Dorne, but it would take years for these trees to grow large enough. While at the Citadel, Wright had made many academic achievements, gaining some recognition. After discussing with the current administrators of the Citadel, they decided to introduce a new academic ranking for craftsmen: technician, senior technician, engineer, and senior engineer, with no title given to apprentices. This new ranking system was designed for workers who specialized in a single field, such as construction, metallurgy, or medicine. It didn't require them to renounce their names or anything like that, but the exam fees were paid by the applicants, and the Citadel would not be responsible for finding them jobs. Storm's End sent Sir Donal Noye and his apprentices to the Citadel to take exams. Donal, who had received Wright teaching, had already become an engineer, and most of his apprentices had passed to become technicians. They worked at the clock tower factory, and Donal was now preparing to take on a second batch of apprentices. In Wright's 4th year at the Citadel, the headmaster and the professors discussed and decided that once Wright took his oath, he would skip the disciple title and be awarded the title of Meister directly. If it weren't for his young age, they felt they might have even granted him the title of Archmeister. But a letter from King Robert brought Wright back to King's Landing. Wright knew himself well. Until now, he had relied on the knowledge of the past world, where he was just an ordinary university student who studied mechanical engineering. All he achieved was using common sense from the modern world to reverse engineer things, conducting experiments and relying on time and repetition to produce results. Now, apart from his knowledge of mechanics, his accumulated knowledge had reached its limit. In the future, he could only provide some directional guidance. I don't know why you asked me to meet in such a place. Talking about things that can't be seen in the light. What do you think of Wright coming to King's Landing? Better stay away from him. He's nothing like anyone you know. I don't know him at all, so how could I stay away? I just want to diligently serve the king. I heard the hand of the king is about to decide on the selection of the Master of Coin. I think I did well in Gulltown. They say Lord Baelish can turn a golden dragon into two with just a little touch of his hand. I take that as a compliment. I don't care about the votes in the Royal Council. What I'm concerned about is that I recently lost some money, but I don't even know how much. The position of the Master of Coin will go to the most capable person. It all depends on whether anyone else surpasses you. The streets of King's Landing no longer smelled of waste. The proposal Wright had made to Robert for city sanitation had been carried out, and while Robert initially thought it would not cost much, the actual implementation, building new drainage systems, hiring farmers from outside the city to haul waste, and constructing manure carts, turned out to be a significant expense. Robert's usual spending habits were large, and he had considered canceling this policy. However, he faced opposition from all the city's nobles. None of them wanted to return to the foul-smelling days of the past, and Robert himself didn't want to smell the stench either. As a result, the policy was maintained and became a permanent national expenditure. Wright, at 10 name day, was still living in Red Keep as the king's younger brother, as he had not yet reached 610. After returning from the citadel, he suggested to Robert that he be trained by Barristan Selmy. Every morning he would spend his time in the library reading, and in the afternoons he would practice in the training grounds. Occasionally, he would discuss academic matters with Meister Pycelle, always walking with a book in hand, looking every bit the scholar. Joffrey, at the age of 3, would run away every time he saw Wright. This was because once, while Joffrey was urinating in the garden, Wright had caught him, and in retaliation, he flicked Joffrey's forehead, causing a bump. The boy ran crying to Cersei, who looked helplessly at Jaime. What could they do? It wasn't as if Wright had meant to harm him. Cersei's mind, still relatively intact, saw it as nothing more than a childish prank. Wright sat in the library, reading, his eyes occasionally glancing at Meister Pycelle. The maester wore a heavy chain made of 24 different metals, showing no signs of discomfort as it hung around his neck. He was well versed in knowledge and would have made a fine Grand Maester. But Wright, as someone who knew the man's secrets, was fully aware that Pycelle had already broken his oath to the Citadel long ago. Once someone betrayed their vows, there was always a second, a third, and more. Wright couldn't help but wonder, had the Citadel intentionally left a loophole in the oath for these purposes? Looking at Pycelle, whose hair had turned completely white, Wright couldn't help but think that the man seemed remarkably fit for his age, almost on par with Lord Hightower. Tywin Lannister had served as the hand of the king for 20 years, and the Lannisters had deeply embedded themselves in the politics of King's Landing. Wright knew he would have to find a way to get the Citadel to replace Pycelle. Despite his harmless demeanor, Pycelle could be a backstabber at the most crucial moment. After a break for lunch, Wright went to the training grounds to receive Barristan's lessons. These lessons weren't daily. Barristan's primary role was as the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, so his schedule was often packed. He taught 3 afternoons a week. Wright had known Barristan since he was a child, and now he was considered his student. As they became more familiar, he started calling him Old Barristan, a nickname Barristan eventually accepted, though he still felt a slight irritation whenever others used it. Wright arrived early, and only a few members of the Kingsguard were training. As usual, he was reading a large book with his left hand while practicing one-handed swordsmanship on wooden training dummies with his right. A while later, Wright saw Robert, accompanied by Queen Cersei and the young Joffrey, along with 7 Kingsguard members, arrive at the training grounds.